Welcome. This talk is sponsored by the Yale Center for Environmental Communication at the Yale School of the Environment, as well as the Yale Center on Climate Change and Health. Based at Yale University's School of the Environment, the Center for Environmental Communication, or YCEC for short, we focus on 4 areas. We conduct research on the psychological, cultural, and political factors that influence environmental attitudes and behavior. We teach students and train working professionals. We convene a global network of climate communication scholars and practitioners, and we inform and engage the public through environmental journalism, including Yale Climate Connections. It's our climate-focused news service that engages millions of people each year, including a short daily radio story that airs on more than 750 stations nationwide. As far as logistics, the chat is closed. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen and be aware that you only see the questions you ask. We have folks monitoring the questions, so be assured your question will be seen, but there are many questions that have already come in and will continue to come in, so we'll only be able to get to a few of them. We'll make a recording of this conversation available on our website and send a link to everyone who registered. Today's talk will be moderated by my colleague, Dr. Anthony Leiserowitz, the director of the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication and a professor at the Yale School of the Environment. He's an internationally recognized expert on climate change beliefs, attitudes, policy support, and behavior, and the psychological, cultural, and political factors that shape them, and conducts research globally, including in the United States, China, India, and Brazil. I hand it to you.
Thank you, Eric. And hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar with Dr. Laurie Santos. There we go. Looks like, okay, good. All right, so as all of you know, the impacts of climate change are happening here and now and already harming the people, places, and things that we love. While a lot of scientific, media, and policy attention is focused on physical impacts like heat waves or droughts, floods, and severe storms, less attention is focused on the mental health dimensions of climate change. And these impacts range widely from feelings of helplessness, depression, or anxiety to full-on post-traumatic stress disorder in the many victims of these unnatural disasters. Just to put this in context, our own national research finds that about 3% of American adults are experiencing acute climate distress, while about 8% report at least one symptom of eco-anxiety or depression. So that's already millions of people. Meanwhile, members of the climate community, and I mean that in its broadest sense, are personally experiencing intense emotions that over time can lead to burnout or unhealthy individual or group behaviors. And of course, they work closely with colleagues and partners and communities that may be experiencing all different kinds of forms of climate-related distress. So ultimately, today's conversation is really about how do we act meaningfully to reduce the harms of climate change while staying healthy, connected, and motivated to do the work. What role should happiness play in the fight for a safe and stable climate? Today, we're fortunate to have Dr. Laurie Santos join us to talk about climate activism without burnout, evidence-based practices to improve well-being. In addition to her work on the evolutionary origins of human cognition, Dr. Santos is an expert on the science of happiness and the ways in which our minds lie to us about what makes us happy. Her Yale course, Psychology and the Good Life, teaches students how the science of psychology can provide important hints about how to make wiser choices and live a life that's happier and more fulfilling. The class became Yale's most popular course in over 300 years, with almost 1 out of 4 students enrolled. Her course has been featured in the New York Times, NBC Nightly News, The Today Show, GQ Magazine, Slate, and O Magazine, Oprah's magazine. The online version of the class, The Science of Wellbeing, which is on Coursera.org, has attracted more than 4 million learners from around the world. A winner of numerous awards both for her science and teaching, she was recently voted as one of Popular Science magazine's Brilliant 10 Young Minds and was named in Time magazine as a leading campus celebrity. And she is a celebrity. Her podcast, The Happiness Lab, is a top 3 Apple podcast, which has attracted more than 100 million downloads since its launch. So we're thrilled to have Laurie with us today. to talk about this really important topic for the larger climate community. Welcome, Laurie.
Thanks so much, Tony. And thanks so much to everyone for having me here. I'm excited to sort of share what the science of well-being really says about how climate activists can protect themselves from burnout. And before we get started, let me try to hop on and share my screen here. So you should be seeing the full version of this image here. And so I wanted to just get started with just a quick introduction to how I got interested in the science of well-being. But then I want to spend most of my time going through my favorite tips that this field suggests for how you can all protect your happiness, feel a little bit less stressed, and deal with the burnout that comes from being in this field that's dealing with such a huge existential problem. And so first off, how did I get into this? Well, as Tony mentioned, I'm a faculty member here at Yale University. Hopefully you're seeing my slides change. Let me know if you're not. And I've been teaching there for about 20 years. And that was when I first started to see this college student mental health crisis up close and personal, where so many students were reporting feeling stressed, feeling anxious, feeling depressed. And of course, being young people facing a climate crisis, I'm sure that was a major factor as well. But what I realized was that what we needed to do was to help students figure out ways that they could protect their mental health. So I kind of retrained in this field of the science of happiness. I designed this big new course that students could take to sort of figure out ways that they could feel better. And as Tony mentioned, it went a little bit viral. In fact, this is what it looks like when a quarter of the entire Yale student body is trying to hop into a classroom to take your class. And so that was how I got interested in this stuff. But what I want to spend most of my time on today is how everyone who's here at this webinar, I'm assuming most people who are in the climate community broadly, can not only wake up to the climate crisis, but do so in a way that doesn't destroy their mental health and destroy their well-being, right? As mentioned, this is an enormous, incredibly scary, incredibly frustrating existential threat to not just like our very lives and ourselves, but to our entire planet, to our entire species, right? And facing those negative emotions is incredibly tricky, right? Facing the frustration of dealing with kind of being in this industry is incredibly tricky. What can individuals in this space do to protect their well-being as they're doing that?
Laurie,
yep.
Laurie, I'm going to interject real quick because I'm seeing comments in the chat about, can we raise your microphone level?
Raise my microphone level. Let me get a little closer to
the other thing is, if you go quickly into Zoom and go to settings, you might be able to, sometimes on its own decides to lower your microphone level.
Let me do that. Hopping into my audio settings. We'll see if we can make this better. Yeah. This is input volume much higher, so hopefully that's working better. Excellent. Thank you for fixing that here, because we want everybody to hear all these great strategies that we have for how we can kind of fix everybody's well-being. So what we're going to do in the short half hour that we have is to actually go through what I think are the top 5 insights that we get from the science of happiness. And the first one is the one that I actually think is the most important. It's that if you look at what the science shows, it suggests that the mental health of all the climate workers out there is going to wind up being important for actually saving the planet. I think if we're those folks who are working in a really difficult, really meaningful industry, often think in the following way. They think, well, I'm working on a problem that's so important. If I don't get a chance to sleep, if I don't get a chance to engage with my social connection, if I don't get a chance to do all the stuff that would protect my well-being, so what? The problem is so big that maybe I'll sacrifice my well-being right now for hopefully kind of success in sort of this climate project in the future, right? And a lot of us, you can see why we might think that way. The problem is that when you look at the science, our mental health doesn't really work in the way we think. Our motivation doesn't work in the way we think. We can't just kind of shelve that and go on and try to perform at the same level. Research really shows that our sense of positive emotion, our sense of mental health matters for our performance. We want to make sure that everyone in the climate space is performing as best as possible so we can solve this problem, coming up with as many innovative solutions as possible. If folks aren't protecting their mental health, the evidence suggests we're not going to get very far. Well, how do we know that? Well, we know that from lots of studies that have looked at the correlation between things like people's sense of positive emotion, people's overall levels of happiness, people's mental health, and their performance. And what research finds time and again is that if you're not protecting your mental health, your performance is going to decrease, right? We know that in part because our positive emotions actually predict something very specific about our performance. It predicts in particular whether or not we're going to come up with some innovative ideas. Again, study after study seems to show that when we're in a good mood, we wind up coming up with better solutions. One of my favorite research examples looked at this not in the context of climate activists, although I think it'd be great to do that research, but in the context of medical doctors. Scholars brought medical doctors into the lab, gave them a really tough, tricky kind of medical problem, right? If you remember that television show House, where House had all these like tricky medical diagnoses, it was sort of something like that. But the key is that half of these doctors were allowed to be in a good mood first. They just watched some silly cat videos, ahead of time, were kind of laughing and in a good mood. What happened? Well, the researchers found that the doctors who had been put in the good mood wound up being more likely to come up with those innovative solutions, the tough ones that you couldn't see. And I think this is really critical as we think about our own performance in this space. If we want to be coming up with creative solutions, if we want to feel energized to come up with the best ideas and keep performing, we need to protect our mental health. But that raises a different question that I think comes up a lot in all activist spaces, but especially in climate spaces. This is the idea of like, well, can I even be happy in the context of this huge, terrible existential problem? Is that even a good idea? Maybe this act of being happy in the space of a terrible threat isn't a good idea. We all have this notion that if you're not angry, you're not paying attention. Maybe we need some negative emotions to try to strive through things. Maybe we should be sort of pushing ourselves to the breaking point if we really want to make change. There's this kind of worry that I often call the Pollyanna hypothesis, which is that if you're not kind of really pissed off and upset, you'll kind of let the status quo go. That if we were kind of happy, we'd sort of, in the words of this famous meme, we would think everything is fine when the sort of world around us is in fact burning, right? But this is sort of an empirical question. If we're in a good mood, do we kind of ignore the big problems of the world? And this is something that researchers like Konstantin Kushlev at Georgetown University have actually tested. And he did this really directly in the context of climate activism. He did this in other spaces too, with other forms of social justice movements. But I'll tell you about the climate one. Basically, what he was interested in is who is actually taking action to fix the climate. And does it tend to be people who are kind of feeling really doom and gloom, experiencing lots of negative emotions? Or does it tend to be the people who are kind of taking care of themselves and experiencing lots of positive emotions? And here, I'm a nerd, so I'm going to show you some graphs. I know folks in the climate community hopefully are sciencey, so they're into the graphs. But here's Kushlev and colleagues' graph, right? I mean, he's plotting at the bottom just these different categories, surveying people's happiness and coding them as very happy, pretty happy, or not too happy, right? And he first looked at people's climate concern, right? How worried are you about the climate? How much kind of climate anxiety are you experiencing? And he first finds what you might expect, which is that like the people who are experiencing lots of climate anxiety are not feeling too great, right? Climate concern tends to track with people who are not experiencing a lot of positive emotion. Of course, we want concern, but more importantly, we want action. And that's what Kushlev and colleagues tested next. Who are the folks who are, putting solar panels on their house, going to climate marches, trying to donate money to climate and so on? And what he finds there, if you look at these different happiness categories, is exactly the opposite effect. It's the very happy folks who are engaging in more of the action. What does that mean? I think that means that if we really want to get action out there, if we really want to fight today for a better tomorrow, we might need to pay attention to our mental health, right? All the negative emotions, all the burnout, all the stress, that might not be helping us. And I think this is important because it gives climate activists a reason to recognize, wait, I actually do have to protect my rest. I actually do have to protect my mental health. It is going to matter for the bottom line. And so I think that's top insight number one, and perhaps, as I said, the most important one, right? We really want to make sure that you remember that your mental health ultimately matters for your success in protecting these things. It should be number one. But the question is, how do we do that? And that's what the rest of the tips are about. Starting with top insight number two, which is that in the climate change space, if you want to protect your mental health, we need to deal with the question of burnout. Really protecting your mental health means not getting to a state where you're feeling incredibly burnt out. And that means that as individuals in the climate space, but also as teams and especially as leaders in the climate space, we need to pay attention to the syndrome of burnout. This is something that I think I don't have to mention, that Tony even mentioned in his introduction, that a lot of folks in the climate space are worried about burnout, feeling burnout, and so on. This was definitely reflected in the questions. Here is just a list of some of the questions I got in the beginning, and it's like, what are some strategies to overcome burnout? How can we avoid burnout? Students are worried about burnout. Some people are experiencing burnout. How can they come back, right? This is something that's really in the water here. And so I think it's essential that you understand from a more psychologically scientific perspective what burnout is, because it turns out that we have some misconceptions about it. One of the biggest misconceptions is that burnout is kind of just along a continuum with some sort of mental health and balance, that it's kind of like you can be a little bit burnt out or less burnt out and so on. And it turns out that this is a misconception because burnout isn't just kind of feeling really exhausted or just kind of experiencing a lot of negative emotions. Research really shows that burnout is a special clinical syndrome. It's a special clinical syndrome that we can wind up in, and one that requires special sorts of remedies. Well, the reason we know this is that burnout seems to have these particular features, especially when you're experiencing a true sense of clinical burnout. And I'll kind of walk through what each of these three parts are. The first is the kind of thing we usually think of when we think of burnout. People who are experiencing burnout experience emotional exhaustion. But this is more than just the usual physical exhaustion. This is that you kind of like emotionally, you can't even. You take a week off and you come back and at 8 a.m. and that Monday morning, you're already feeling kind of exhausted. Again, not just in terms of your physical tiredness, but in terms of your emotions feeling depleted and kind of down. That's sort of symptom number one. But there are two other symptoms of burnout that wind up being really important, I think, especially for folks in the climate movement. One is what researchers call depersonalization, or what you might differentially call a sort of sense of cynicism. You just feel cynical about everyone and everything, right? Both the people you're working with, your constituencies, the people around the world. You just are on your last nerve when it comes to dealing with people. That's a sense of depersonalization. Like you just kind of can't deal with people anymore because you're feeling so cynical. The third part of burnout is one that can be even more painful, which is what researchers call this sense of personal ineffectiveness. Even if you were doing your job as well as you could possibly be doing it, it just wouldn't matter. You just feel this sense that nothing you can do matters, right? So these are the three clinical features of burnout. Again, it's different from just kind of, being a little down in the dumps, feeling a little exhausted. It has these other interpersonal and kind of a sense of effectiveness features too. And so if you're experiencing burnout, the question you might have next is like, what can we do about it? And to answer that, we need to answer the question, well, where does burnout come from in the first place? And here I like to turn to the work of Christina Maslach, who really is the sort of academic psychology expert on burnout. She has a really fantastic book on burnout called The Truth About Burnout. And she makes the case pretty clearly. Here's just a quote from her book. She notes, burnout does not result from a failure of character or a lack of ambition. It's not a personality defect or a clinical syndrome. It really is an occupational problem. What Maslach argues is that burnout stems from a particular way that we as individuals, with our values, with our kind of priorities, interact with a workplace environment and what's expected of us in a workplace. And that is where burnout comes from. The idea there is that because this is what causes burnout, when we think about how to fix burnout, we need to fix these factors in a workplace environment in order to feel better. And so what are these kind of occupational factors that sort of lead to burnout? Well, Maslach identifies 6, and I think it's worth kind of going through these. The first is what she refers to as a perceived lack of control, right? You just can't control your workplace environment. You can't control what's going on. You just kind of feel like you don't have any agency. A second problem is when your workload just gets incredible, right? You're just working too much. You're not taking enough time off and so on. A third factor is what she calls rewards. This can be kind of extrinsic rewards, like how much you're getting paid, but more often than not, it's intrinsic rewards, whether your work feels valued by the people around you and so on. In addition, burnout can come from kind of having a kind of toxic community when people aren't working together to do things. It can stem from fairness in the workplace if some people are getting paid more and working less, and these kinds of issues. And finally, it can stem from what she calls a values mismatch, right? The reasons you got into this work just don't match what's happening on the day-to-day, right? Organizations that have these 6 factors in place are more likely to induce burnout in the folks that work there. And I started with this first one, perceived lack of control, because honestly, I feel like this is just by nature an occupational hazard of working in the climate industry, if we're just going to be frank, right? We're dealing with an existential problem that one person alone just simply can't fix altogether, right? And so inherent in the climate work is the fact that you're going to have this sort of sense that the control is very hard. But the key, I think, to reducing burnout in the climate community is to make sure, especially in individual workplaces and on individual teams, that you're working as hard as possible to make sure that occupationally you're getting a fair sense of the rest of these other 6 things. And I think these are things that teams and leaders can sort of really work on carefully. The first is sort of making sure that workloads are not only fair, but also just reasonable, right? That might mean kind of allowing yourself as individuals or your teams, if you're an organization, a little bit more time off. I think the rewards is another big one. Remember, Maslach finds that it's about the intrinsic rewards that matter. What can you do to increase gratitude within a team, to talk about the effect you're having, to kind of highlight stories where the work that you're doing is actually making a difference, right? Seeing those rewards. I think finding ways to embrace community and making community not just within a team, but especially within the groups that we work in is pretty cool. And then finally, I think with just in terms of a values mismatch was another spot, is to really make sure that you're finding ways to remember how your values and the reasons you got into this, you're seeing those things playing out on the ground. And sometimes for team leaders, that involves sort of reframing the work you're doing as part of the big picture, finding space as individuals to come back to your values and your big picture. All of these things can help a lot. But the key is that when we think about burnout, it's not just about kind of individual self-care and sort of fixing the way we interact as individuals. It's trying to come up with ways that as workplaces, we can engage with these factors in a healthier way. That's how we prevent and fix burnout. And so that's top insight number 2. I think to deal with sort of some of the kinds of stresses that come up in the climate space, we need to understand what burnout really is. It's not just like, oh, you need a weekend off. We need to think about these specific 6 organizational factors. And I think at least with the last 5, what are ways that we can actually make them better within our organizations? That's what we need to do. But as mentioned, it's not just burnout at an occupational level that folks in the climate space are facing. There's also lots of individual things we can do to protect ourselves from stress, from negative emotions, and so on. And the rest of the 3 tips are about those. What can we as individuals do to try to fix our overall mental health so we can keep fighting this important problem and for these important causes? And that gets to top insight number 3, which is maybe not necessarily what you might expect from a sort of a lecture about how we can feel happier as kind of individuals in the climate space. Because top insight number 3 argues that in addition to kind of focusing on your mental health, you need to find ways to embrace and allow your negative emotions. Ultimately, these things are good and they're going to be helpful, but we need to know how to deal with them as effectively and as healthfully as possible. And it's no secret that climate work involves lots of negative emotions, right? Like it is by nature an incredibly anxiety-provoking existential threat that we're all facing. I think there's lots of areas in the climate work where we experience anger, whether that's dealing with people who are in denial or dealing with our friends and family members who kind of just don't get it and aren't taking action. I think there's a lot of moments of frustration in climate work, from these sort of little moments of hurry up and wait when you're dealing with organizations to the fact that we want to make progress, but we seem to be kind of hitting a wall. And then, of course, there's real moments of grief and true sadness. I think especially for those of you in the climate community that are working with marginalized communities who are facing terrible events and awful trauma because of what's going on, right? These are real negative emotions, and it's worth recognizing that they are normative. It makes absolute sense that you're feeling the anger, the frustration, the fear, the grief that you're feeling. It makes sense. But of course, these emotions don't feel good. And when we're faced with something that doesn't feel good, one of our instincts is to try to squish those emotions down, to just kind of power through and pretend we're not feeling them, right? We assume they're just kind of harmful, they don't feel nice, so we kind of want to suppress them. But psychological research has looked at what happens when we suppress our emotions. And the answer doesn't seem to be that good. In fact, suppressing our emotions seems to hurt us and our physical bodies, and it hurts our performance at work. How do we know this? Well, we know this by studies by folks like James Gross and his colleagues at Stanford. They do these studies where they bring subjects into the lab, and instead of having them watch those kind of happy, like cat videos, they have subjects watch videos that are truly sad, truly angering, truly scary. And what they say is, whatever you do, I want you to suppress your sadness, make it so that nobody knows you're feeling sad, really try to push it down as much as possible. Subjects can try to do this, but Gross and his colleagues find that there are interesting consequences. One of the consequences comes to people's performance. He gives people a memory task afterwards, a decision-making test. Basically what he finds is people perform terribly. Like all the work that your brain has to do to kind of continuously hold those emotions down, those are areas of your frontal lobe and other parts of your brain that you don't have for kind of making strong decisions, right? Something we, of course, want everyone in the climate space to be able to do is to like make good, innovative decisions. You're not doing that when you're suppressing your negative emotions. But also, suppressing our negative emotions also has terrible bodily consequences. Even in this short laboratory task, James Gross can find evidence of people experiencing cardiac stress, just suppressing the little sadness of some short YouTube video that you watched. Imagine the kind of cardiac stress that so many of us in the climate space are going through all the time, right? Suppressing these kind of negative emotions, right? So suppressing our negative emotions don't work, but I've just told you that these emotions are normative. We're supposed to have them and they're actually useful for something. So the question is, how do we actually deal with these? How do we actually get through them? And the key for negative emotions is to get through them, you actually have to go through them. There's kind of no way around except through. But researchers have often found a whole host of strategies that we can use to navigate and allow our negative emotions in a healthier way. And one of my favorite, very practical strategies, the kind of thing you can bring on whenever you experience that moment of frustration at the hurry up and wait or grief when you're dealing with a community. It's a practice that's been popularized by the meditation teacher Tara Brach, and it's a practice that goes by the acronym of RAIN. RAIN stands for Recognize, Allow, Investigate, and Nurture. And I'll sort of walk through how you do this practice in just a second. So let's say you're experiencing a negative emotion, right? You get out of a meeting where something was supposed to happen and it's not going to happen. Or you see some post online from some climate denier that's like saying something ridiculous. Or you watch a friend go on a round the world trip, like completely ignoring like the cost of their flights in terms of climate problems, right? Like you just have that moment where you're feeling frustration, sadness, grief. You notice you're dealing with a negative emotion. And you have already gotten to the first step of RAIN because you are recognizing that you're dealing with a negative emotion. It sounds like a simple step, and it is one, but I want you to take it one step further if you're engaged in a RAIN practice, which is to really kind of classify the emotion that you're dealing with. Don't just say, oh, I'm feeling yucky. Get very specific. Maybe you're frustrated with feeling a side of loneliness because other people don't get it. Maybe you're feeling anxious with a sense of overwhelm on top of it, right? Really try to carefully describe and label the emotion that you're dealing with. That's the first step to recognize. But then you take what I think is the hardest step, which is allow. You say, you know what? I'm just going to sit here for 5 minutes and allow this feeling to be there just as it is. I don't have to love it, but I'm just going to let it sit there, right? You kind of, in the words of the poet Rumi, you sort of invite this terrible emotion to dinner, but you give your brain something to do while you're sitting with that negative emotion. And that's the next step of the RAIN practice, the I, investigate. You say, I'm going to look at what this emotion feels like in my body. And so you literally sit there and investigate, how does this feel? Maybe it's making your brows furrow or your chest is getting tight. Maybe you have a strong craving to check your email or eat something or get a drink or whatever it is. Don't act on that. Just notice, when I experience the frustration of feeling like I'm being roadblocked for the stuff I want to do, this is what happens in my body. When I experience grief at looking at what's happening in communities, this is what's happening in my body. And the key to the investigate step and why it works so well is that research shows that our emotions are kind of like a wave, right? When we first start to pay attention to them, they will get a little bit more intense, but eventually they'll kind of crest and go down. The problem is we never sit with our emotions long enough to do that. But if we sit with them, what's often called urge surfing in clinical practice, we can actually, watch our emotions sort of take their course, as long as we have sort of something for our brain to do when we're doing that. And that means that the investigate step is very powerful. It means you can kind of get to the other side of this investigating step and sort of experience what it feels like to finally get through that moment of the emotion. But you don't end there. We end with the final step of the RAIN practice, which is nurture, which is you say, how can I take care of myself? How can I give myself some self-compassion? Maybe I need to take something off my plate. Maybe I need to call a friend, right? What can you really do to kind of nurture yourself, given that you're experiencing that negative emotion? Seems like a simple practice. It does take some time, right? You're going to spend like 5 to 10 minutes engaging in this practice, done right. But the effects of RAIN are incredibly strong. There's research showing that a practice like RAIN can reduce negative emotions in groups like palliative care workers and first responders. These are people who are dealing with negative emotions and terrible things like, all the time in their work. I think it can be an incredibly powerful practice for folks in the climate space to regulate a whole host of negative emotions. And so that's top insight number 3. We need to find ways to not just avoid our negative emotions, but really allow them to be there, allow them to take their course. And I think a practice like RAIN will be incredibly powerful. So that's top insight number 3. But top insight number 4 builds on that last step of RAIN, that nurture step. And it is that if we really want to protect our mental health in the climate space, we need to find ways to give ourselves this sort of gift of self-compassion. Self-compassion sounds great, but it's not the way a lot of us spend our time, especially when we're dealing with a big, important problem. Usually we want to do more, right? We're beating ourselves up for not being as effective as possible. We're assuming that we're these like inhuman robots who can work all the time with no breaks on a really tough problem and just be okay. And when we don't do that, we kind of like hate ourselves and feel like we should push ourselves more. We look down on ourselves, right? This is self-criticism. And research shows that, of course, it's probably not that great for happiness. It makes you feel kind of guilty and depressed and miserable and kind of resistant to so many of their things. But in addition, it also negatively affects our performance. It winds up pushing us to procrastinate more. It winds up making it harder for us to get things done, right? It's just ultimately not an effective way to motivate ourselves, to sort of beat ourselves up a lot. The alternative, and one that's incredibly effective, especially in hard workplaces, is the practice of what's called self-compassion. If you want a great primer on self-compassion, I definitely recommend this book by Kristen Neff, just called Self-Compassion. Kristen Neff at UT Austin has done some really fantastic work on self-compassion, sort of breaking it down into its 3 steps. And the first step of self-compassion should be very familiar from that recognized part of the RAIN practice. It's what Kristen Neff calls mindfulness, but it's basically just being mindful of what's going on. It's like kind of calling a spade a spade. This situation is tough. This situation is scary. I hate that we're in this situation that we are. Like, this feels really scary. I feel frustrated, right? You're just labeling these emotions and mindfully noticing them, right? But then you follow up that noticing with what she calls common humanity. You say, and this is normal. It is normal in the face of this terrible existential threat to be incredibly scared. It is normal in the face of this workplace that I am in to feel really frustrated, to feel grief, to have a hard time, to need rest, right? Like, I'm only human. This is the kind of thing that happens to everyone. It makes sense that I'm going through this. But then once you kind of give yourself permission to experience that it's sort of normal and normative to go through those emotions, you end with the final step, which is what she calls self-kindness. What can you take off your plate? What do you need right now? Ask yourself the question of how can you be kind to you? You know, if you were your best friend giving you advice right now, what would you say to yourself, right? These 3 steps, again, sound pretty simple, but they have some strikingly powerful effects when you really engage with this form of motivation. One of my favorites, and I think one of the ones that's really relevant, not just for climate activists, but in your work with climate communities, is the fact that research shows that self-compassion can actually reduce the effects of trauma. Kristen Neff herself studied this not in communities that have been affected by climate action, but in the US military. This is, of course, an organization where you can experience lots of trauma and, of course, the negative effects of trauma, things like PTSD and so on. Neff sort of trained Afghan and Iraqi veterans on strategies of self-compassion, just going through these 3 steps. And she finds that that reduces their overall rates of PTSD, even for individuals who've been in combat and war zones themselves. So a powerful tool for really reducing trauma, again, something we're going to need as more and more communities are devastated by these negative effects of climate change. And so I think as you work with communities who are dealing with the effects of climate change and as these effects continue on, this is a lovely strategy to work with, right? It makes sense that you're going through this. It's human to feel this stuff. How can you take care of yourself, right? These simple steps can be incredibly powerful. In addition, Neff's work shows that climate self-compassion strategies can actually help people do things that benefit them in the future. She's studied this in the context of eating healthier, right? Making good choices in the moment so that you can be healthier in the future. She finds that self-compassion can increase our savings and so on. But there's also hints that if we're kind of investing in our future selves by being more compassionate, this might also be a path for allowing people to engage in all the climate actions that we want them to take, which often have a feature of, it's a little bit of a cost right now, but obviously it will help everyone in the planet in the future. I think self-compassion can be an important path to that too. But in addition, there's lots of work showing that self-compassion is a fabulous way to boost up your other compassion, right? The compassion that you have for other people, whether that's your spouse, whether that's a partner at work, whether that's your kids, like a powerful way to boost your sense of understanding other people and being kind to them. And of course, this is something that we always need in the context of climate work, whether that's with these communities that have been affected, but also by dealing with deniers, right? Like, it's no secret that one of the problems of doing climate work is just being so pissed off at people who just don't get it. by working on your own compassion, having compassion for yourself, you exercise these muscles to feel compassion for those people too, even the deniers, right? Not to say that it's okay what they believe, but to come to an understanding which can help you work with them, that can help you ideally communicate these things in a way that they'll understand, right? So super helpful to engage in self-compassion, but that sounds kind of very vague. What's a very practical strategy you can use in the moment to experience more self-compassion? And one of my favorite ones is to give yourself a little bit of self-compassionate touch. You're sort of seeing it in this picture here, maybe putting your hand on your heart. Another one I love is to give yourself a self-hug. It sounds kind of silly, but your body doesn't know who's touching you. It's a very strange feature of the human mind. We just don't know. When you experience something like a hug, it kind of feels like someone else who's being kind to you is doing that. And so, especially if you have some time alone, it looks cheesy, but psychologically it's very effective. Give yourself a little hug, maybe even just like, a little stroke on your shoulder, what someone who really cares for you would do if you were feeling upset. And then walk through those 3 steps of self-compassion. First, mindfulness. This is tough right now. I'm struggling. I'm feeling hopeless. But then it makes sense. Common humanity. That makes sense. Stress is only part of life. I'm only human. Dealing with this huge problem makes sense that I'm feeling overwhelmed. This is hard. It makes sense, right? But then self-kindness. What can I do to help myself? How can I be kind to myself? What do I need right now? What can I take off my plate? A big one for climate activists. Again, a powerful strategy for reducing your trauma, reducing your negative emotions, but also making you a little bit more effective. So that's top insight number 4. We need to give ourselves the gift of self-compassion. Now we end with the kind of insight that I think is most important for the second set of questions that I got. The first kind of biggest group of questions I saw was on burnout, but the second biggest group of questions that we got was on the question of hope, which is how we can embrace a sense of hope and optimism in the face of this. And this insight is that if you really want to kind of get agency and energy to deal with these problems, you need to find hope, but maybe a particular form of hope that we'll call skeptical hope. And again, just so you can see, so many questions about this, right? How can we reconcile optimism in the face of all the stuff that's happening? How to maintain hope and keep fighting, right? How do you find hope when, it's the 11th time you've tried something and the 10 times before it didn't work, right? How do we find that? And one of my strategies for looking at this actually comes from a great new book that I recommend for all the folks working in climate action. It's called Hope for Cynics by the neuroscientist Jamil Zaki. And he makes this interesting distinction in his book between what you might call naive optimism and what he calls skeptical hope. So what do I mean by naive optimism? When we think of optimism, we often think of like this sort of, again, Pollyannish sort of view that everything's going to work out, right? It's just going to be great. And it comes with sort of a sense of sort of toxic positivity of like, I'll just look on the bright side in this horrible thing, right? Lots of evidence, again, that sort of forcing positive emotions, like pretending that nothing's wrong, this kind of thing doesn't work, right? It has all these interesting backfire effects. But a better strategy is what you might call this skeptical hope, where you say, yeah, the problem is huge. It's incredibly scary. But if I simulate the billions of different possibilities, there's at least a few that make things better. There's at least a few that fix things. Maybe not fix things perfectly, but my agency can actually make changes that will make things and people better off, right? This is skeptical hope. And I think this is exactly the remedy that we need in the climate space, right? Where the problem, you can't kind of bring full optimism to this, right? Like in the sense that like there is a big, big problem that we're all facing. And if we don't take action soon, things are going to be pretty bad. But my guess is most of you are in this space because you can see at least a slim chance of a positive future through your own agency and that of other people, right? That is skeptical hope. And what Jamil finds is that in some ways the opposite of skeptical hope, which is giving up hope altogether, right? Just kind of this sense of like full cynicism that anything can get done. It has a whole host of negative consequences, right? When you believe that things are impossible, that they're never going to get better, research shows that those who express these views tend not to vote, right? Because why vote? It doesn't really matter what's happening. Those who express cynicism for climate and even in other domains tend not to protest. They tend to not go out and do things. And those that seem to think that there's no hope there wind up like not engaging in the actions that we need to save, right? When you don't believe you have any agency, you tend not to take any. And so this act of kind of finding a path path to skeptical hope, I think is one that's really, really important. And it's the kind of thing that we need to embrace even more often, I think, in the climate community. And just to give you an example of, if you're sometimes, because I think can be tricky to find like, okay, but what are the paths, right? Like, where is a spot where I can kind of bring hope to this? I'll just share my favorite one, the one that I bring, which is this lovely work by Liz Dunn and Jay-Z Zhao at the University of British Columbia. They've put together a website called happyclimate.org, which you can check out. But basically their research is showing more and more that if you look at the particular individual actions that we all need to kind of improve the climate, they tend to hang really closely with the kind of individual actions that we need to feel happier, right? The act of sort of reducing our kind of consumption and like maybe using things scarcely, whether that's travel or eating meat or whatever it is, that sort of scarcity winds up breeding more enjoyment. They also find that actions like carpooling and biking and these things are the sort of things that increase our happiness overall. They basically put together this lovely program showing that if you want to make yourself as an individual happy, one way to do that would be to engage in all the actions that we know matter for climate change. And that's something that gives me a little bit of hope that there's a sort of intersection where it makes sense for people to do this stuff. We might be able to find messaging that gets them there. And so that's top insight number 5. We need to kind of embrace the sense of skeptical hope. That's the kind of thing that will give us agency and give us energy to kind of continue on. So those are our top 5 insights. I hope I've given you some kind of a path to sort of fixing your mental health, to convince you that it's important to fix your mental health, and at least some strategies that you can use to get there. And now I'll stop sharing my screen so that I can continue this conversation with Tony and take all of your questions. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Laurie. That was really fantastic. I hope everybody else was taking notes. I've seen you give this talk twice and I'm still taking notes. So yeah, it's fantastic. All right, so we've got a lot of questions that people have provided. So let me just jump right on in and start with one that I think is probably relevant to a fair number of people on this call, because these are people who are already quite active in the climate movement and are leaders in some form or fashion. I mean, some of them are leaders of full-on climate organizations, or they lead teams or whatever. So this is really a question for leaders, is how does one balance the work of rallying a group and like saying, yes, we can solve this, like, look at the progress we're making and all that, while at the same time, you're like incredibly aware of the limits of action, the scale of the problem, the scope of the problem. And so this perhaps tension within people to say, I am feeling these things as a leader, including all the frustrations that just come inherently with leadership, and yet needing to give, of course, a sense of accomplishment and forward progress to the people you're leading.
Yep.
I just wondering if you could address that.
Yeah, so I think one way I tend to think about these things is that there's sort of an effective 2-step that you can engage in, especially if you're a leader, right? One is to do some work to regulate your sense of everything is doom and gloom, nothing is working, I'm feeling incredibly frustrated, right? Because if you don't regulate that for yourself, it's going to leak out. You might be like, yeah, we accomplished this thing, but and that means that leaders need practices like RAIN, right? They need to take time to allow their own negative emotions rather than sort of suppressing them down and pretending everything's fine. I think that's sort of step number 1. But step number 2 is to genuinely find the small things that indicate progress, right? Like none of us, we would love it if we could just like snap our fingers, or somebody puts a policy in place today that instantly, all the carbon in the atmosphere goes away, but like that's not going to happen. What realistically progress is going to look like is very tiny things. And so I think you need to remember that those tiny things are moving us towards a bigger whole, right? Another thing that sometimes is helpful that I found is to kind of look at the history of some of these kinds of movements, not just in the climate space, but in all spaces, right? They're all tiny wins, right? And so we just need to remember that those tiny wins can actually aggregate. And I think as a leader, if you find evidence of that, that can be incredibly important. But remember sometimes that these rewards don't necessarily have to be a climate win, right? They can actually be a reward that what you're doing matters for the team, right? So that you helped on this particular project meant that someone else in the team benefited, right? That we cohered together, we worked together, we solved our goal, we met our target, right? They're tiny ways that rewards can be processed, that we can see wins, even if it's not an immediate win for the climate. In the work that you do, Tony, I know it's like, this study means we understand something better, right? We didn't, again, immediately shut off all of carbon, but that's like a really important step forward. And so I think as a leader, your ability to kind of find those wins can contribute a lot to the rewards that people experience. So thinking about those factors that increase burnout, they can help with the reward part, they can help with the sense of community part, and they can help with the kind of fairness part. As a leader, you're kind of giving credit where credit is due. And so I think that two-step of regulate your own negative emotions, make sure you're not feeling as much as possible the frustration and the anger and the grief and so on, and then look for the wins. It's okay if they're tiny. They matter even if they're tiny.
Yeah, that's great. And just to kind of add in a couple things, both from our experience and from even our research, is one, I like this idea of small wins a lot. That somebody once beautifully put this as of course, you've got milestones, but you also have inch pebbles.
Yes.
And so how do you make sure that you break the problem down to, hey, we accomplished this, like we just held a rally, right? Like that isn't a major accomplishment. Did it solve climate change? Probably not, but nonetheless, you should take great pride in your people and yourself for actually having accomplished a successful event. Another thing that we have found really helpful in the past is just simply acts of gratitude. And partly that is acts of gratitude for yourself to say, I accomplished this, and you should give yourself literally a pat on the back if nobody's there to do it for you. I love that concept. Give yourself a hug, give yourself a pat on the back. Because your body is dumb. It doesn't know any better.
Doesn't know.
It's still valuable. But the other is thank yous to others. And so like for a number of years in the early days of Twitter, we used to actually run a Thanksgiving Day event called Climate Thanks. It was a hashtag, Climate Thanks. And the goal of that was really to just, for the community writ large, to say, hey, let's just take Thanksgiving, a day that we're all supposed to be thinking about the thanks of family and friends and, food and all of that, but just turn that to climate change. Because when you look around, it turns out there's amazing work being done all around us. And if you are like, thank you, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, for, constantly speaking about climate change, thank you, Sunrise Movement, for, holding politicians to account. Thank you to my local utility for actually making clean energy available, and on and on and on. I just don't think we do enough of that, because of course, so much of just even the fundamental metaphors we use is about fighting, right? It's about fighting climate change. And yes, to be honest, we're not fighting climate change. We're fighting the polluters that are causing climate change and the CO2 emissions themselves. But it's just to say that there is a really important role for gratitude and thanks in the movement to say thank you to everybody else that is doing this. To do that. And I find that is incredibly inspirational when you see those stories start to come in.
Yeah, and I love that. And we know so much about what gratitude does. And one of the things we know from gratitude is that it's an incredibly good motivator. One study by Adam Grant's group at Wharton Business School did this study where it was for fundraisers at a university. So these are people who are calling and asking for money, right? So if you're in the climate change fundraising movement, this might be relevant, right? Where he just had, and half of these fundraisers had the boss come in and just genuinely express gratitude for what they were doing and talk through the little wins that they got because of the tiny donations. What he finds is that those fundraisers worked 1.5 times as much as they had before that infusion of gratitude, right? And it's not like they were trying. It was not like it was hard for them, right? It just like that gratitude kind of boosts your motivation. It boosts your excitement about working. And so it's one of the easiest tools you have as a leader to make yourself feel better, to make the people that work with you feel better, and to like boost everyone's performance at work too.
The other thing that this also reminds me of is we recently published a national study asking Americans what gives you hope about climate change. And the number one answer by a pretty long shot is actually seeing and hearing about other people taking action.
Yep.
Because what we find is that many, many people who are already alarmed about climate change nonetheless feel relatively isolated and alone, in part because we're not talking about climate change enough. So that's also part of it. But in particular, seeing that people are putting up solar panels across the city, right? Seeing more electric cars on the road, hearing the stories of people who are rolling up their sleeves and taking action and not just sitting on the sidelines and saying that they're just going to watch the world burn. And I will just plug, that's one of the things that we've been trying to do with Climate Connections. We just passed our 10-year anniversary. So we've told now almost 3,000 stories, many of which are exactly those kinds of stories of individuals who, from every walk of life, who are trying to make a difference within their domain of influence. And they're incredibly inspirational. I mean, it's amazing what people are doing. And yet we don't tend to celebrate or even know about much of what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's really critical, right? Because a key ingredient in hope, particularly, is the fact that other people are taking action, right? We get this sort of social proof from others. And so if we want to feel hopeful, which boosts our agency, this idea of seeing these positive stories is essential.
So I want to go back to something we talked about a little bit in the before this, and that's coming back to this role of leadership of a group of people. But you use this really lovely analogy of parenting. So I'm wondering if you could just unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as leaders, we kind of deal with our own teams, but we're often in a position of dealing with people who like just don't get it, right? And like, whether that's climate deniers or the businesses and organizations that we work with who just like don't have the kind of haste that we have from our own beliefs, or maybe the kind of people that we work with where we want to like, get them active even more, right? Like there can be all kinds of people that we experience negative emotions by dealing with, right? But what we know is that the most effective way to motivate them, again, whether it's a climate denier or a business partner we're working with or an organization, is not to like scream at them and be like, are you crazy? This is terrible. Like, we need to fix this thing. Like, that doesn't work. What we need to do is calm ourselves, explain in words they understand, et cetera, et cetera. And that can be really hard, right? That's emotionally taxing. That can like boost our cynicism. But many of us have done that in a different domain, in the domain where we deal with children, whether it's our children or other children, right? Like we often have to face that. Think as a parent, many of you have felt like that frustration, that anger, that like we need to, but you don't scream at the kids. Hopefully you take a moment in the bathroom, you calm down, you do whatever practice you need to, and you explain it in a way that they'll understand, right? And you get it because it's like, ultimately, I have a goal to just get this done, right? We need to get out the door, to catch the bus. I'm mad at you, but like, I'm just going to regulate that. And this is what's going to be most effective. I think that kind of strategy and giving yourself that grace that like, yes, I'm feeling this negative emotion, but I'm going to find ways to regulate it because that's going to be the most effective strategy. And I think this comes up a lot in science communication. Of course, the people facing this crisis closest on are so angry about what's happening and are so scared. But that doesn't need to be the only messaging, because if that's the only messaging, it might not be the most effective messaging for all the goals that we have with our climate community, right? And so I think this way of kind of using your kind of parent voice and your sort of parent regulation, emotional regulation strategies when dealing with other people is an effective way to do it. I also think this is another powerful spot where practicing compassion can be really helpful, right? It's, you want to like wring the neck of these climate deniers. But if you realize that they have their own problems and the information they've gotten might not match, and you would probably be in the same situation if you'd grown up like they did and had the same news sources that they did, et cetera, you can kind of find this common humanity, right? It makes sense that given this, right? Like, how can I be kind to you? How can I talk to you in a way that you'll understand, right? Those kinds of practices are super powerful.
Yeah, and I'll just underscore, this is the incredibly important role of knowing your audience. Okay,
Yes.
this core principle to effective communication is know your audience and then go more than halfway to meet them where they are, not where you are. Like I may want to yell and scream about this problem, and yet I'm talking with somebody who's still like, yeah, I think I heard about that once, but I don't know what anything of, I don't understand what it is or anything. Yelling at them is not the solution, even though you might want to say, where have you been the past 30 years, right? Yes. So it's just like, again, think about what you're trying to achieve, and you're trying to achieve social change, okay? At the individual level, at the community level, at the city, state, national, and even global level. So get super clear to yourself, and that is the power of that self-reflection, it seems to me, of getting clear about what you're actually trying to achieve, and how does your own emotions and your own emotional regulation help you achieve that goal? Hopefully, you harness those emotions to actually help you be more effective, to motivate you, even though it may not mean that you actually express those emotions in the moment to that individual.
That's exactly right. Exactly right.
So speaking of specific emotions, here's one that I'm seeing a number of questions about, and that's guilt.
Mhm.
So here are two questions. How do you deal with a sense of guilt that you're not doing enough, which unfortunately is just like baked into the cake? You're never
Yeah.
doing enough. That's just reality. So how do you deal with that? And then the other is, even when you know that taking care of yourself is key to your effectiveness as a climate activist, how do you deal with the guilt of feeling happy or relaxed while the planet is literally burning? So this is like an even deeper question, right? Of how do you live with the tension of being a human being on a planet where you are now very aware of the horrors and pain and suffering that is happening all around, and yet you're also on a planet that is more beautiful and wonderful to be alive than perhaps ever before in some ways. So how do you hold that tension
Yeah.
at that deep kind of existential level?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think this is one of the reasons I love that work by Konstantin Kushlev that I mentioned, right? Because he kind of addresses this question, right? Which is that if we're only doom and gloom, if we absolutely think that everything is terrible, we're just not going to be able to get up in the morning, right? Like, we're just going to put our duvet on our head and be like, I can't even, right? And I'm sure in the climate space, there are people who've had those mornings. It's okay. It's normative to have those mornings in this space. But what we know is that effective performance in this space is going to require you to take care of your mental health, and it's going to require you to experience positive emotion, right? Even if you just look at it from the base practical brass tacks, right? I want to be the most effective person, affecting change in this space as I can. You do that by protecting your mental health and having positive emotion, right? And as you've noted, you can find it, right? If you're in this space, it's because you care about the planet, it's because you care about nature, it's because you have a belief in people's beautiful moral ability to come together and fix things, right? It's because you work with the communities you work with because you care about those particular communities, right? And you find beauty in them, right? And so that beauty and that awe and those positive emotions are there. But just for the effectiveness reason, you need to give yourself permission to engage with it. On the guilt question specifically, I think this is another one where we kind of need to go back, to recognizing our negative emotions and dealing with them, and kind of practicing a form of what you might call radical acceptance, which is like, look, this is just the state of the world, and I could push against it and flail against it, but that's just going to cause either a lot of suppression or a lot of suffering, right? So what I choose to do instead is to honestly look at it and say, this is what it is, right? You obviously, most of us have to do that with climate change because where we are is where we are. We hope we can change it, but where we are is where we are. We can't kind of go backwards. But I think we also have to bring that same radical acceptance to our own limitations. We're one person. Like, we are human beings that require sleep and eating and rest and having to go to the bathroom every once in a while. Like, we are just humans, right? And sort of pushing ourselves against that, pretending, well, we don't need to sleep or we don't need, these kinds of moments of rest or whatever. That's just like, it's not possible. For that, I have a strong recommendation to check out this lovely book by Oliver Burkeman called Time Management for Mortals, where he basically makes the case that, like, whatever you care about, especially if you care about something as big and as purposeful as stopping the detonation of our planet, like, you're going to run into normal human mortal limitations about your own time and your own energy and your own need for rest. And you can flail against that, but ultimately, true time management is going to require coming to terms with those limitations and radically accepting them. And so I think the more you can do that, you kind of naturally get rid of the guilt, because you're like, this is the way it is. I don't need to self-flagellate when this is the only way it could be given the current circumstances.
Yeah, and just to add to that, first of all, I think we often have a fundamental cultural problem in the United States in that we are such an individualism heavy culture that we tend to think, how do I solve climate change? And not how do we solve climate change? And that it's those social connections, social bonds that not only on a very pragmatic level make you far more powerful than you are as an individual, but also turns out to address a lot of these same things because you're doing it in community. And frankly, it's just a lot more fun, or at least it should be. So the other one last thing just to add there is the deep emotion that we haven't really talked about. And the great thing about a great conversation is we don't have enough time. But it's just to point out that I do hope people take the time to center their thoughts about love. Because the reason why we're often anxious or angry or outraged et cetera, is because the people and the places and the things that we love are at risk because of climate change. Okay. And so it's really easy to get fixated on those, let's call them negative emotional reactions, and they can be incredibly inspiring and motivating. But really what's going on below all of that is the fact that you love this planet, you love this world, you love these people, you love these things that they, in this case, the polluters, are destroying, degrading, taking away from all of us. So let's just not forget to center all this on its beating heart, which is love.
Love it. Love it.
Okay, Eric, keep us in line.
Thank you, Laurie, for your thoughtful and incredibly useful insights, and to Tony for moderating the conversation. And thanks to the Yale Center for Climate Change and Health for co-sponsoring. We will send everyone a follow-up email after this event with the recording, additional resources, including all of the links and research that have been mentioned, and information about the next event of our fall speaker series, which will be on September 18th at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, where we hope you'll join us for a discussion with German climate activist Luis Neubauer. Have a great rest of your week. Take care, everybody.